So, welcome to Tune In Tuesday. We're now in session 10 of the One God of Original Christianity, and it's going to cover even more attributes of God. And of course, also, this is the 1 year anniversary, I believe, of Tune In Tuesday. So, thanks everyone for your support. And we're going on for another whole year at least, and more. So, thanks for your prayers in that respect. Right now, we're continuing our study of the traits of God in that second category under His name, which I have put under the word El, the name El, God as the Mighty One. And this list of His traits are part of His divine nature, which are the consequences of His infinitude. There are several ways of looking at the traits of God. God's infinite traits are something that He cannot wholly share with those whom He has created. He can only share parts of them. For example, only God is eternal, but He has made everlasting life available. Now, eternal has no beginning or end. Everlasting has a beginning point, and then it goes on. Do you see how that is a sharing of only part of it? Only God is infinite, and there is none other like Him. He made the universe, so He must be greater than it. Therefore, everything in the universe must be lesser. In the last session, I showed that there have to be another dimension or dimensions outside of our realm in which the celestial speed of light does not apply. Well, if that is the case, then there is no time there either. That's why God, who dwells there, is eternal. Even Einstein implied the possibility for other dimensions, though he didn't like it at all. There is a phenomena called quantum entanglement, in which a pair of particles that are related to each other are related even at a great distance. And this entanglement paradoxically seems to violate the speed of light. Well, nothing's supposed to be able to do that. That violates all the rules of our realm, which we have repeatedly observed to be true. So, if quantum entanglement has been observed, it is proof of another dimension in which the ultimate speed limit of anything is non-existent. Now, we cannot conceive of such a dimension. It even freaked Einstein out. Einstein famously derided quantum entanglement as spookhafte Fernwirkung, or spooky action at a distance, unquote. So, it spooked him. But that is the dimension where God is. So, sorry for making your mind go doing so soon in the teaching. Einstein would have said, "Das ist ein Kopfknall sicher." A headbang for sure. Meine Kopf exploderieren. He had not seen the purple smoke commercial, so he just said his head exploded. There even are indications of extra-dimensional things in the book of Revelation. Look at Revelation 21. Verse 21, it says, "And the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of one pearl. And the street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. And I saw no temple therein, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are the temple of it. And the city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon, to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. And the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it, and the kings of the earth do bring their glory and honor into it. And the gates of it shall not be shut at all by day, for there shall be no night there. And they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations unto it." So, there's no sun, there's no moon, There's different light. There's no night. These all indicate a different dimension in which light does not operate. Revelation 22, verse 1. And he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruit, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. And they shall see his face, and his name shall be in their foreheads. Verse 5. And there shall be no night there, and they need no candle, neither light of the sun. For the Lord God gives them light, and they shall reign forever and ever. So again, in this place, there's no night, there's no sun, there's not even any artificial light like a candle. So this language indicates a different dimension. See, wow. Revelation 21:1. And verse 1 again, he said, I saw a new heaven and earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there's no more sea. That's no more the adversary's realm. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. So, consequently, I believe that we, in our new bodies, will be able to go into the spiritual dimensions. We will be like angels. And angels go there now, so that's that. Okay? So what does this have to do with holiness? Well, to review, holiness is to be separate, not of this world. In fact, in the manifestations, God said, we live in this world, but we're not of it. So he knew what we were going to cover tonight. So holiness is to be separate, not of this world. You can look that up in Brown Driver Briggs. The top head meaning of that word, Kodesh, is apartness, sacredness, separate from defilement. Then the second meaning is of things that are set apart by God's presence. Now, it should go without saying that the ancient Israelites did not know about dimensions outside of our space-time, but that modern concept helps us understand more about God's holiness. But they still thought of God as being something separate from the world. He created it. Therefore, it follows that he must not be of it. So, therefore, he is separate or holy. Understanding what holiness really is makes a great difference. But, ever since Philo, most theologians have mixed the meaning of purity in with holiness. Why? Well, it fits their Greek-infected ontology model better. Philo is trying to bring in the Greek philosophers' incorrect concept of ultra-perfection, perfect being so perfect that God could not even move, and it ballooned from there. Even the derivation of the English word holy is contributing to that contamination, because it comes from the Anglo-Saxon halig, hal, meaning well or whole. So, because of what was known at that time, Philo's infection, when English came into being many centuries later, they chose this word holy to translate the Hebrew word Kodesh. They probably could have used a better word, like separate. So, even when we say the word in English, we must still think of it in its Semitic sense, pre-Philo, as set apart, separate from the world. But even the Jews were misusing it. Look at Isaiah 65. Isaiah 65 verse 2. God says, I have spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people, which walks in a way that was not good after their own thoughts, a people that provokes me to anger continually to my face, that sacrifices in gardens and burns incense upon altars of brick, which remain among the graves and lodge in the monuments, which eat swine's flesh and broth of abominable things in their vessels, which say, Stand by thyself, and come not near to me, for I am holier than thou. These are a smoke in my nose, God says, a fire that burns all the day. Behold, as written before me, I will not keep silence, but will recompense, even recompense into their bosom. So, that holier than thou, that's the origin of that. That's the essence of man's religion. Legalism, Phariseeism. Wow. It's like smoke in God's nose. It makes him sneeze. That's got to be the figure of speech achutio, right? One of the defining statements that God gave me a long time ago regarding my research on this topic is, quote, you cannot define the Semitic idea of holiness by the Greek concept of perfection. That came to me when I realized the error of the Logos doctrine and how far-reaching it was in Orthodox theology. That statement has represented that plateau in my research on one God ever since. God had brought me to that point, but I always had expected to learn even more about it, and in this series, I am learning more. Now also, I'm going to quote you from Girdlestone, Synonyms of the Hebrew Old Testament. He says, few religious words are more prominent in the Hebrew Scriptures than those which spring from the root Kodesh, which is used in some form or other to represent the being set apart for the work of God. Perhaps the English word sacred represents the idea more nearly than holy. I agree with that, which is the general rendering in the Authorized Version. The terms sanctification and holiness are now used so frequently to represent moral and spiritual qualities that they hardly convey to the reader the idea of position or relationship as existing between God and some person or thing consecrated to Him. Yet, this appears to be the real meaning of the word. Wow. The point involved in every case is relation or contact with God. Thus, the Sabbath day was holy because God rested on that day. It was set to be set apart by Israel as a pledge that he had sanctified or set apart the people to himself. The mountain of the Lord was to be called holy because he would dwell there. The sanctuary was to be made that the Lord might dwell among his people. The firstborn, by being hallowed or set apart, was regarded by God as his own. Even the censers in which sinful men offered incense to God became hallowed by that very act. Numbers 16:38. God himself was regarded as holy, that is, as a being who from his nature, position, and attributes is set apart and revered as distinct from all others. A person or thing consecrated to him appears to be the real meaning of this word. It was to separate itself from the world and the things of the world because God thus separated. They were to be holy, for he was holy. Joshua says, you cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God, set apart and distinct from all other beings. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive or put up with your transgressions nor your sins. In accordance with this teaching, the Lord was to be sanctified, that is, regarded as occupying a unique position, both morally and in regards to his essential nature. So, that is in agreement with my position that the word Kodesh would be better translated as apartness or separation instead of holiness. You see, I anticipate that there's going to be some pushback from the Orthodox because of what I have been teaching. I mean, you don't negate a whole branch of theology, ontology, and it goes quietly. But we saw that I am that I am is not the proper translation. And if we translate that correctly, then it negates that whole idea of the Greek philosophers' view of God as a perfect, ultra-perfect being. We saw that Yahweh is God in his relationship to his creation. And all 40 of those different names related with Yahweh relate to that. God and his relationship to his creation. If there were the idea of God being so separate as far as a perfect being, ultra-perfect being in that state, then we would see much more of that terminology in the Old Testament, and it is not there. So that is why I say that the Septuagint's translation of I am that I am, ego eimi ha'an, is false. And I do not agree with that whole branch of theology. So it's great to have citations from other scholars that back me up when it comes to the effects of this. And so holiness is one of these things. It means separateness. Now, we have to think like Semites when we read the Bible. They are more practical than conceptual. The Greeks theorized that God was in the state of ultra-perfection, but that produced that immovable mover paradox. They should have stopped right there and said to themselves, this does not make sense. Therefore, this line of reasoning is wrong. But Socrates' daimon, that's where it started, prevailed. You see, there may be some things in which a greater and lesser exist, but there are some things that are binary, either yes or no, and no gray area in between. For example, let's consider incorruptibility. If one is incorruptible, then they cannot be corrupted. So that is a binary trait. Either you are or you're not. Only two possibilities. Binary. So there is no such thing as ultra incorruptibility. But the Greek idea of ultra perfection has infected so many things. Many theologians insist that there is an ultra state of everything. And to most folks, trying to conceive of or question or debate that is beyond them. So they just throw up their hands and say, you philosophers deal with it. Well, that gives the philosophers license to say whatever they want unchallenged. Well, I say no. We need to eradicate that infection before it multiplies. Yeah, we folks are in the world, so we are influenced by it. Therefore, we all have been corrupted to one degree or another, because there are degrees of corruption, less influenced or more influenced, but there are no degrees of incorruption. You see? So, ultra incorruption cannot exist. Same is true for righteousness. One is either righteous or they are not. There are no degrees of righteousness. So there cannot be a greater ultra and a lesser state of righteousness. You see? Binary traits are either yes or no. There's no other possibilities. But with holiness, God has shown us there is a greater and a lesser. How so? Well, God has illustrated this in the tabernacle and the temple with the holy place and the holy of holies. God is holiness, because he resides outside the world, totally separate. The visions of his throne reveal angelic beings there around his throne, so they can go where he is too. They can pass through from our world into God's spiritual dimension. That was what was represented by the Holy of Holies and the holy place in the temple and in the tabernacle. But in the Holy of Holies, how do I know that angels can go there? Well, what was in the Holy of Holies in the temple? The Ark of the Covenant, right? And what was on the cover of the Ark? Cherubim. So that clearly communicates that there definitely are angelic beings with God there in the Holy of Holies, His most holy place where He dwells. We know that is outside of the world. In fact, one of the angel's main functions is to go back and forth in and out of the spiritual realm from God to us to carry out God's will in our world. Very clear. God also comes into our realm via forms of concretion via the angels. These manifestations, or the technical term for them, is theophanies. Renee used that word. God, phanerosis, reveal, theophany. There are many instances of this, and theologians seem to pay close attention to them. But if you read those passages carefully, you'll see mention of the angels that are involved. For example, the theophany in Exodus 3. It says, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him, Moses, in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. So, those theophany passages also seem to represent God as speaking. Well, that is the job of a messenger, right? To convey a message from someone. But there is a cultural difference to take into account, because in our culture, if we were conveying a message from a superior, we would say, so-and-so says such and such, right? But in their culture, having the Semitic idiom of the author and the agent, they could speak for their superior and say, I say such and such. So even though the theophany may seem to be a manifestation of God Himself, He is doing it and speaking via an angel. See? So as Renee taught, not all 6D octaves of His light can be seen by us. Only a small sliver. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. No man can see God and live. It'd be way beyond purple smoke. Even way beyond hot plasma. Therefore, only a small part of Him is being revealed. It's a facsimile, something we can understand. That is why the visions of God have so many symbols in them. We can't really see God Himself, but He's communicating what He wants via these visions and the things in them. When this occurs, everything that comes in contact is consecrated, made holy. Consequently, there is a greater holiness where God resides, and a lesser holy place or thing in this world that is consecrated. However, that is different from purity. It's separation. For example, in the burning bush incident, God said that that place was holy ground. Well, did the dirt change? Was it chemically purified? No, I think not. It was ceremonially set apart because of the presence of that manifestation, the concretion from God. And then Moses was told to remove his shoes. That correspondingly was a ceremonial act. See, another example is, when we get born again, do we receive all of God in us? Is that Holy Spirit in us God Himself? No, it can't be. God creates a spirit within us which must be less than Himself, because that's germane in creation. If you make something, it's got to be less. But it is still holy and it's still spirit. Now, just think. In the future, when we are with Christ, we are going to be like angels, right? Does anyone not believe that? We will be individual spirit beings then. So, are angels God? No, of course not. They are spiritual beings that God created. They must be less than He is. Consequently, we shouldn't have any problem understanding the concept of God creating a lesser spirit than Him within us. Now, that is an earnest, like Ephesians 1:13 says and 14. A guarantee certifying more to come. But even then, in the future, we won't be God. We will be like angels. Then, in that full form, we will be able to appear in God's presence and see His face in the most holy place where He resides. That's functional, practical. It's Semitic thinking. They thought of the things of God in these terms. Since they were not as much conceptual thinkers, perfection and purity were not a concern. We can see that because of the paucity of occurrences of those words in the Old Testament. You see? They relegated the other stuff into Deuteronomy 29, the things that belong to God. That ultra, beyond comprehension stuff, if it exists at all, was part of God's business and not there. It's like, danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger, do not intrude into the things that belong to God only. If you go there, you will be lost in space. God's space. Now, I know that I have emphasized Semitic thinking, but we obviously are not Semitic. We've been brought up on the Greek side, me included. We speak English. That's an Indo-European language. Semitic languages are in a totally different linguistic category. They have different rules of language which apply. And our Western logic and method of analysis, the scientific method, came from Aristotle and the rest of the Greek philosophers. Even our math is from Euclid, a Greek. You know what? The Romans did their math and used Roman numerals. Can you imagine doing that? But it was natural for them because that's how they counted. Well, same with us. So it's inevitable that we will still be trying to approach the things of God the way that we've been brought up to think. I mean, I can't go, poof, you all now think like Semites. You all got to walk like Egyptians. Well, I mean, you know how to do that. Just wherever you go, keep your hands parallel with the ground. All right? No, we're always going to be influenced by our Greek roots. So it's okay to analyze. We just have to recognize the stop signs at the border of God's territory and not intrude like the Greek philosophers were inclined to do. We will be winning similar thinking people from our culture to Christ, so we need to communicate with them in terms they understand. I think that one of the reasons, besides God's grace and help, that my teaching technique is effective is my analytical approach. Because I'm always probing for the answers. I'm always asking who, what, why, where, how, when. And I also put myself in my opposition's shoes to anticipate questions. But I also have learned that one cannot despise those who differ. Having been bullied for so long in my formative years, I know what it's like to be demonized and marginalized, and I know how I reacted. So it's important to have compassion on your opponents and not just say that they're all from the devil. I believe they want to be right. So it's important to keep the lines of communication open by being decent and not being condescending or derogatory. But I also strive for the practical, and even though I can think conceptually, I strive to bring things down so the average believer can understand them and apply them. So I look for keys that open eyes and set people free. Sandy brought my attention to a book, and I'd like to read a little bit from it, The Semantics of Biblical Language by James Barr, about this Greek and Hebrew thought. In chapter 2, he says, the habit of contrasting Greek and Hebrew modes of thought has become extremely commonplace in modern theology and has had a very great influence upon it. A brief and quite unoriginal sketch of the way this contrast is generally made may be given here. We may begin by remarking that the interest in the contrast has been found not only among theologians. Professor John McMurray, for example, lays a great emphasis upon it in his book, The Clue to History. For him, as for much of the modern theological movement, it can be laid down that Christianity is essentially Jewish. The contrast of the Jewish and the Greek needs to be drawn out so that we may truly identify the Hebraic elements in our heritage of culture or religion. There is a danger otherwise that these elements may be obscured, whether because the European mind has an emotional barrier against Jewish culture, or because we naturally tend to think in the Greek manner and tradition, and thus interpret away the Jewish element as some of the theologians put it. In the tendency to emphasize this contrast, different interests may be seen at work. With McMurray, it's a desire to delineate Jewish culture as one truly religious culture, and to see that in the reaction to its contribution, the clue to cultural history. From the theological side, however, other interests may appear. One way is it is a means of asserting the uniqueness of Christianity. Christianity, as long as it is properly understood, and this means to a large extent adequately demarcated against the Greek-dominated European culture, belongs with the Jewish thought as a roughly homogenized entry, clearly set apart from the other currents of European thought. In another respect, the contrast of Greek and Hebrew thought and the alignment of Christianity with the latter go to emphasize what is now called the unity of the Bible. The unity is said to lie not only in the rather formal, old-fashioned way of prediction of the New Testament events in the Old, or the foreshadowing of the New by certain patterns of life and worship in the Old, or in the discernment of a historical continuum through the Old Testament history and down into the Jew, but is a common way of thinking, a common cast of mind and mold of expression, which operates throughout the Bible, which is more noticeable and influential than the variations which it, of course, undergoes in the minds of individual authors and traditions. Now, this is getting a little long-winded here, but he goes through and shows the main contrasts drawn between Greek and Hebrew thought are usually the following. Number one, the contrast between static and dynamic. The Greeks were ultimately interested in contemplation, the Hebrews in action. Movement could not be ultimate reality for the Greeks, to whom being must be distinguished from becoming. There we have the whole argument. Wow. And the ultimate must be changeless. For the Israelites, the true reality was action and movement, and the inactive and motionless was no reality at all. Wow. There's more here that you can read in this book. But number two, the contrast between the abstract and the concrete is the second way. It is a characteristic procedure of Greek thought to work with abstractions. It's not good enough to know what is a good horse or a good table. You must find out what is the good. Abstract terms of the kind we call qualities and properties are central in discussion. This procedure can be connected with the static nature of Greek thought mentioned above. And then there's a third one, the contrast in the conception of man. The Pythagorean Platonic tradition is usually taken as the typically Greek tradition for this purpose. In Greek thought, man is seen as a duality with an immortal soul imprisoned or confined in a mortal body. The two are only temporary or accidentally related. Now, we've seen the effects of that on Christianity, haven't we? In Hebrew, the thought of the soul is the living person in his flesh. Soul and flesh are not separable, but one is the outward visible manifestation of the other. There is no thought of the soul living apart from the body. Then finally, to sum up, the contrast may be expressed as the contrast between the divisive, distinction-forming, analytic type of Greek thought and the totality type of Hebrew thought. I think that when I went through the virtues in the Sermon on the Mount, that gave us a clear idea of these distinctions. So, with that said, here's my humble analysis of this category, all the things that are under L. Since God is holy, that is separate, He is incorruptible, and He is righteous. Then, because of this separateness, incorruptibility, and righteousness, God must be good. Since these are the case, compared to the things of this world, he is glorious. Incorruptibility, righteousness, and goodness are binary traits. They are yes and no. But we will see that gloriousness is another trait that can have a greater and a lesser. Then, because God is not of this world, he is separate, he is invisible. That's a binary trait too. You're either visible or invisible. We cannot see him because he is in another dimension. Also, because he is in this separate dimension in which there is no time, he is eternal. And because he also is omnipotent, omniscient, and having foreknowledge, he must be immortal. But that's not because he's all-knowing and foreseeing and powerful enough to stay alive. It's because he cannot die. Because he created this world and is omnipotent, he is indefatigable. He never gets tired. Because of all this, God must be singular, unique. He is the only true God. So do you see how all these flow from holiness, not being of this world? So that is why it is the head of this category. Now, of course, this is all ongoing research. So I recently added the trait singular, and I've moved the trait immutable into another category. Finally, because of all these things that God is, he is special, unique, and separate from the world because he created it. So he is to be honored and worshipped. The term living God applies in this sense because the Bible uses living as opposed to dead idols. And then I put spirit into this category because that is how God comes and relates to our world from his separate dimension. Now I know that outlook is a mixture of Semitic and Greek. And yeah, I am looking for some systematization, some sense of logical organization and consistency, like Edwin Hatch talked about in that quote I read, but not too much. That is how we Western folks think. We're curious. We want to understand. Now, yeah, I know a little bit of leaven's the whole lump. So where's the dividing line? Where's the boundary? Well, I think we should keep the binary attributes binary and the variable ones variable, and keep the ultraness out, except where it makes sense. So that is what we're going to do in this category of this study. So the next one I want to cover is incorruptibility. Incorruptibility. Now, obviously, if we're going to consider what incorruptibility is, we're going to need to understand the opposite. Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10. It says that you may put difference, separate between holy, kadesh, and unholy, the Hebrew word is chal, and between unclean, tame, and clean, tahor. So we already covered what kodesh is. That's separate, sacred. Now chol, which is unholy, means profane, common. So it's not special. It's been ceremonially desecrated. Tame means unclean, but this is a ceremonial uncleanness by coming in contact with something forbidden or defiled. Tahor is ceremonially clean by washing or sacrifice of material. It could be said it's pure, but that's just material, like gold. Leviticus 22:32. Neither shall you profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. I am the Lord which hallow you. Kodesh. So God made them holy. They did not change genetically or chemically. So it's not dealing with pureness here. He set them apart because of his presence among them via his word. He gave them his law, which told them to be separate from the world. Ezekiel here is another example. Ezekiel 22:26. It says, her priests have violated my law and have profaned, that's the verb, chalal, mine holy things, kodesh, and they put no difference, separated, between the holy, kodesh, and the profane, chal. Neither have they showed difference between the unclean, tameh, and the clean, tahor, and have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned, chalal, among them. So, because of my definition of holiness being separation, using the original Hebrew meaning and not the connotation of pureness that Philo brought in, my critics may say, well, you don't believe God is pure? Well, no, I didn't say that. That's just a setup. If you want to bring in the idea of pureness, that's fine, but it fits better under this category of incorruptibility, cleanness, ceremonial purity. I just don't want to open the door for the ultra connotation that would bring in the ultra perfection infection into this. Because incorruption is binary, and pureness also is binary. You're either pure or you're not, yes or no. So, Ezekiel 20, verse 42 is another set of scriptures here. You shall know that I am the Lord when I shall bring you into the land of Israel, into the country for which I lifted up my hand to give it to your fathers. And there shall ye remember your ways and all your doings, where you have been defiled, tameh, unclean. And you shall loathe yourselves in your own sight for all your evils that you've committed. And you shall know that I am the Lord when I have wrought with you for my name's sake, not according to your wicked ways, nor according to your corrupt doings, O ye house of Israel, saith the Lord. So, he did this for his name's sake, for what he stands for, because he is not corrupt. He's incorruptible. Romans chapter 1 uses this word. Romans chapter 1 verse 19 and following. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, his traits of being God, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God, and the Greek word there is incapable of decay, aphthartos is the word, the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and the birds, and the four-footed beasts, and creeping things. So they took him out of his realm into the realm of man. See, Genesis 6 talks about corruption. Genesis chapter 6, verse 11 and 12. This is dealing with just before the flood and the state of man, how bad it was. And God looked down and said, in verse 11, the earth also was corrupt. That Hebrew word is shakath, before God. And the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, shakath. For all flesh had corrupted, shakath, his way upon the earth. There's 3 shakaths there within 2 verses. So it was bad. Deuteronomy 4 also talks about this. Deuteronomy 4, chapter 14. And the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes, Moses says, and judgments, that you might do them in the land whither you go over to possess it. Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for you saw no manner of similitude on that day that the Lord spake unto you in Horeb out of the midst of the fire. So they didn't see what God looked like. Lest you corrupt yourselves, shakath, and make you a graven image, the similitude of any figure, the likeness of male or female, the likeness of any beast that's on the earth, the likeness of any winged fowl that flieth in the air. This is just like Romans 1. The likeness of anything that creeps upon the ground, the likeness of any fish that's in the waters beneath the earth. And lest thou lift up thine eyes into heaven, when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the host of heaven, should be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all nations under the whole heaven. So, this corruption was behavioral. They were not staying separate. They were being touched or influenced by worldly, pagan, satanic things. Moses even told them in Deuteronomy 31, verse 29, he said, "For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves," shakath, "and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands." So that's corruption. The corruption happened because they brought in influences of the world and did not stay separate, holy. Now also, in this category of incorruption, in the last few minutes here, I'm going to bring in the idea of God not being tempted or tempting anyone, because that fits under this category of incorruptibility. See, if God cannot be tempted with evil, then he is incorruptible. However, in order to put this together, there are some idiomatic language that we have to understand in order for all the verses on this subject to be in harmony. Now, the primary verse on this is James, chapter 1. James, chapter 1. It says, "Blessed is the man that endures temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. Let no man say, when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempts he any man." Well, if God is incorruptible, then he cannot be tempted with evil. Alright? He doesn't tempt any man either, it says in verse 13. "But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, brings forth death. So do not err, my beloved brethren." However, there's a bunch of verses here that talk about tempting and testing. And like I said, there's a number of Hebrew idioms here that we have to understand. So let's look a little bit here in the remaining time at Exodus 15. Exodus 15 verse 22. So it says, "Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it is called Marah," means bitter. "And the people murmured against Moses, saying, What shall we drink? And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he cast into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them." The word proved is nashach. Verse 26. "And said, If you will diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon you, which I brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that heals thee." This is the first Jehovah attribute, the Lord that heals thee. This is the context for it. Then, Exodus 17 verse 1. "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeyings according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. And wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, Why do you chide with me? Why do you tempt Nashah, the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water." Well, this is after the first incident, isn't it? "And the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore is this that has brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? they be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said to Moses, Go on before the people, take with thee the elders of Israel in your rod, whither thou smotest the river, take in thy hand and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. And the people did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So he struck the rock, and water came out. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted Nashah, the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? Now here's another one. Psalm 95, verse 9. We'll begin in verse 6. O come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart, as in the provocation, as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted Nashah, me, and proved Bachan, tested me, and saw my work. So we have a problem here, because in James it says God cannot be tempted, neither tempts he any man. All right? That's very clear. But then you have these incidents in the wilderness with the water where the people tempted God. Now how can that fit? Well, there's another verse here. Deuteronomy 6. We'll read that before I answer that question. Deuteronomy 6, verse 16. And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give you great and goodly cities which thou buildest not, and houses full of good things which thou fillest not, and wells digged which you didn't dig, vineyards and olive trees which you didn't plant. And when you shall have eaten and be full, then beware lest thou forget the Lord which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God and serve him, and shalt swear by his name. Thou shalt not go after other gods of the people which are round about you, for the Lord your God is jealous among you, lest the anger of the Lord thy God be kindled against thee and destroy thee from off the face of the earth. Verse 16. You shall not tempt the Lord your God as you tempted him in Massah. Okay, well, it says they tempted the Lord here, but James says you can't tempt God. He's not temptable. He's incorruptible. So, what is the answer to that? Well, if you remember, I think we handed out in one of my earlier series the 2 pages from the beginning of Young's Concordance, where in some of the older versions of Young's Concordance it has hints and helps to Bible interpretation. I'm going to resubmit these again so that you can download them if you don't have it. And it goes through a whole bunch of different idioms, because Hebrew is different from English. They have a different way of speaking. For example, one of them, remember, is the author and the agent. That's in here. That's number 7. The language of the messenger frequently glides into that of the sender. We get down to number 70. Now, number 70 has several parts. It's on page 2. We are familiar with the Hebrew idiom of permission, where that's 70 number B, where it says active verbs frequently express a permission of it, and then its first example is Exodus 4:20. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. I'll permit it to be hardened. But number 70, at the head of the category, it says active verbs frequently express only an attempt to do the action. So, I think that is the solution to the apparent contradiction between those accounts of the people tempting God at the times where they didn't have the water, at Massa and Meribah, etc. So, God cannot be tempted. The people tried to do it. They attempted to tempt him. That's this Hebrew idiom. I think that is the resolution of that contradiction. But also, there's some other words in here, because it also talks about bahan, to prove or test me, and nasha, to test or assay or prove, and bahan, to examine or test, are very similar. Fortunately, this is talked about by Girdlestone in his book Synonyms of the Old Testament. He has, in one of his chapters, he talks about Satan and the things that Satan does. But he goes on to say on page 461, before leaving this branch of subject, it may be well to notice that Satan is never designated as the tempter in the Old Testament. The English word tempt or temptation occurs 16 times. In Malachi 3:15, the Hebrew word is bahan, to prove or test, as metals are tested in the crucible, where the same Hebrew word is rendered prove. In the remaining passages, the word nasha, literally to test by smell, hence to put to the proof, is used. In all these passages, with one exception, namely Genesis 22:1, where we are told that God tempted or tested Abraham, the word is used with reference to the way in which man has put God's power or forbearance to the test. Thus, in Exodus 17:2 and 7, we are told that Israel tempted God in the wilderness, and the place therefore was called Massa, a name derived from the word Nasa. In Psalm 78:41, we read, they turned back and tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. This limitation was the setting of an imaginary boundary to God's power and goodness, and thus calling him out, calling him forth to step over that boundary. That makes that verse live, doesn't it? The temptations in the wilderness are referred several times, both in the Pentateuch and Psalms, usually in the same sense. In 3 passages, however, namely Deuteronomy 4:34, 7:9, and 29:3, reference is made not to the provocations which God endured when his forbearance was put to the test, but to the mode in which his purpose towards Israel and his power of working wonders were proved and demonstrated by his conduct towards Pharaoh and the people. The meaning of the 2 words, which we render tempt, will be more clearly seen if we collect the passages where they occur with the other renderings. So, he gives bakan and he gives nasa. And so, what I'm going to do here is I am going to include these pages from Girdlestone, and I am going to give an assignment, because there's a number of different ideas that all come together to try to understand this topic. For example, God is good all the time. I taught that as part of my Jesus Keys to Life series. We know that God is incorruptible, right? But then you have the incident given forth in the book of Job, where God and Satan seem to be negotiating, and God says to Satan, go ahead and do this or that. Well, how does that fit? Then also, we have the incident with Abraham sacrificing Isaac and God testing Abraham. In order to handle those things, it's going to take much longer than just this session that we are in. And so what I want to do is give you an assignment to look at these occurrences in Girdlestone in preparation for our next session. So that's where we're going to stop right now, and we're going to take up with this next week at the next Tune In Tuesday session. So, bless you much.